The only reason the flat Earth hypothesis exists today at all was the crusade of one man, a 19th century showman and inveterate contrarian named Samuel Burley Rowbotham, who, I am embarrassed to say, operated under the name Parallax. The name is doubly ironic since parallax, the apparent shift in the positions of distant objects due to change in line of sight, is how the Earth's motion around the Sun was conclusively proven. To spare my own blushes, and to avoid confusion, I shall be referring to him strictly as Rowbotham. A native of the British Midlands, Rowbotham grew up in the 1830s, when the word science was beginning to replace natural philosophy as the term for the testable investigation of the natural world. Rowbotham saw all the current scientific understanding as a vast conspiracy of entrenched elites, and argued that the common man could free himself from the received idiocy of these arrogant sophists by employing the direct observation of their own senses. Having personally observed the old Bedford Canal, he claimed he could see all the way along its 6-mile length, and thus that it and the world were completely flat. Rowbotham combined his flat Earth hypothesis into a broader geocentric and creationist worldview, and claimed that the Newtonians, as he called scientists, for he too embraced the idea that no one thought the Earth was round until the age of modern science, were conspiring to push the public toward atheism by denying the word of God. It is somewhat ironic, given the anti-Semitic cast of much recent flat Earth demagoguery, that the idea was initially conceived to defend the honor and authority of the Book of Genesis. A master debater and rhetorician, Rowbotham could convince entire halls full of people of his views, counter the first-hand accounts of surveyors and seamen for hours in 120-degree heat, and leave mathematicians fuming. That said, he was also known for occasionally skipping out on his audience when debates didn't go his way, leaving them to deduce that the program had in fact ended. Despite his Christian fundamentalism, Rowbotham frequently moved in radical socialist circles, and from his more extreme socialist acquaintances, he learnt the word zetetic. Derived from the Greek for to inquire, zetetic was recast by Rowbotham as free inquiry, unburdened by the assumptions and prescriptions of dogmatic overlords, and reliant only on one's own observations. Rowbotham's definition of dogma apparently did not extend to the Bible, as he freely reinforced his claims with biblical passages. In 1864, he expressed his new worldview in a book, Zetetic Astronomy, Earth Not a Globe! In which he outlined what would become the standard view for flat Earth geography. The Earth was a flat disk, centered on what we call the North Pole. Compasses, for some reason, point toward this center, and that's what creates the illusion of circumnavigation. The sun, moon, and stars are only a few hundred miles above the surface, while Antarctica didn't exist at all. Instead, the edge was encircled by a giant wall of ice, preventing the water, and presumably anything else, from falling into whatever passes for space in this cosmology. One has to wonder, though, if the purpose of Antarctica is to keep things from falling off, why the dominant fauna of that region are vast colonies of flightless birds. One of the most wholehearted embracers of Rowbotham's ideas was John Hampden, a raging Christian polemicist who, in a series of pamphlets and letters to scientific publications, fiercely denounced all of academia, the church, and especially the press, for spreading the lie of the Earth's rotundity. The competitive and unscrupulous Victorian publishing world was only too happy to disseminate his views to a paying audience. In January 1870, Hampden decided to go for broke for his beliefs. He placed an advertisement in the journal Scientific Opinion, offering between £50 and £500 to anyone who could prove scientifically that the Earth was round. Unfortunately, someone decided to take him up on it. A brilliant, if somewhat naive naturalist named Alfred Russel Wallace. A popular, if admittedly pointless pastime of history buffs is to ask, what if? What if Hitler had won the war? What if the Muslims had conquered Europe? What if the Roman Empire never fell? Alfred Russel Wallace was one of history's unsung what-ifs. Self-taught in the natural sciences but lacking a degree, he paid his own way through a series of odd intellectual jobs: specimen collector, examiner, teacher. In 1857, during his travels in the Malay archipelago, Wallace independently arrived at the theory of evolution by natural selection. But, being only an amateur, before publishing, decided to obtain the opinion of a man he respected, Charles Darwin. Darwin had been working on his own version of the theory for 20 years, but thanks to Wallace's unintentional warning shot, hurriedly published Wallace's theory alongside a few dated references to his own work, and officially claimed co-discovery. It is interesting to speculate what would have happened if Wallace hadn't asked for Darwin's opinion. Would he have obtained sole credit for his discovery? Would we now talk of Wallacean evolution? Would creationists today be decrying Wallaceism? At the very least, Wallace's experiences show that scientific discoveries are not inventions of man. That is not to say that Wallace has been forgotten by history. He is considered the father of biogeography and has a biogeographical boundary in Southeast Asia, the Wallace Line, named after him. Still, he never received the recognition he arguably deserved, largely due to the fact that he was an unapologetic maverick who openly supported spiritualism. Darwin himself had decried him for, quote, murdering their child by bringing evolution into disrepute. Whatever else Wallace was, he was certainly not a member of the elite, and would have done well out of the wager. Also, he considered that a conclusive demonstration of the Earth's curvature would be enough to silence the, quote, paradoxers, as he called fringe believers. In short, he was exactly the kind of person who would take a bet like this. Upon reading Hampton's challenge, he showed it to Sir Charles Lyell, the founder of modern geology, and asked if he should take the bet. Certainly, Lyell responded. It may stop those foolish people to have it plainly shown them. These were more innocent times. On the 8th of February 1870, Wallace and Hampton agreed to sign a contract and set £500 for the wager, which was to be conducted at the birthplace of the Flat Earth movement, the Old Bedford Canal. Wallace then allowed Hampton to select his own referee, William Carpenter, a choice he would live to regret many times over, as Carpenter was not only a close confidant of Hampton's, but a firm believer in the flat Earth. A printer and stenographer by trade, Carpenter saw the flat Earth as an example of the democratization of knowledge. Artisans, workers, and laborers could form their own ideas about the shape of Earth without having to rely on the assertions of so-called experts. On the 5th of March 1870, Wallace arrived at the Old Bedford Canal to calibrate his instruments for such things as atmospheric refraction. He then set up the experiment. In his own words, iron parapet of Welney Bridge was 13 feet 3 inches above the water of the canal. The Old Bedford Bridge, about 6 miles off, was of brick and somewhat higher. On this bridge I fixed a large sheet of white calico, 6 feet long and 3 feet deep, with a thick black band along the center, the lower edge of which was the same height from the water as the parapet of Welney Bridge, so that the center of it would be as high as the line of sight of the large 6-inch telescope I had brought with me. At the center point, about 3 miles from each bridge, I fixed up a long pole with 2 red discs on it, the upper one having its center at the same height above the water as the center of the black band and of the telescope, while the second disc was 4 feet lower down. It is evident that if the surface of the water is a perfectly straight line for the 6 miles, then the 3 objects, the telescope, the top disc, and the black band, being all exactly the same height above the water, the disc would be seen in the telescope projected upon the black band, whereas if the 6-mile surface of the water is convexly curved, then the top disc would appear to be decidedly higher than the black band, the amount due to the known size of the Earth being 5 feet 8 inches, which amount will be reduced a little by the refraction to perhaps 5 feet. Of course, a central pole about 5 feet higher than the line of the bridge was exactly what was observed, but Carpenter contested the result, claiming that the telescope was improperly leveled and didn't have a crosshair. Exactly what the experiment would have gained from the telescope having a crosshair is unclear, but nonetheless Wallace agreed to rerun the experiment with the telescope fully crosshaired, and got the same result. It was here that Wallace learned a painful lesson about confronting fringe believers. You can't win, because they don't need to be right. Upon glancing through the telescope, Carpenter gave a cry of triumph, and said that because the central pole was below the crosshair, and because the line of the bridge was below the central pole, that meant that they were all in a straight line, and thus the Earth was flat. Wallace reacted with incomprehension. This was so bizarrely wrong, it might as well have been transmitted from another planet. Not only were the crosshairs, pole, and bridge marker transparently not in a straight line, But the crosshairs had not been aligned to anything in the field of view, and so had as much relevance to the experiment as a fleck of mud on the lens would have. Needless to say, the acrimonious assemblage could not reach an agreement, and a third party was called upon to break the stalemate. The money was entrusted to a final referee, magazine editor John Henry Walsh, who found in favor of Wallace and paid him the money. Hampden was apoplectic and began what would become a years-long hate campaign against Wallace. In 1871, Hampden sent a death threat to Wallace's wife, leading to his arrest. After some time in prison, he was fined £600, but transferred all his wealth to his son-in-law's name so that he could declare bankruptcy and not have to pay. He continued to publish pamphlets declaring himself a victor over the scientific establishment. His letters to his opponents in the wager became so numerous and vitriolic that Walsh eventually sued him for libel, and Hampden was remanded on £100 bail. Eventually, after failing to maintain the peace, he spent 2 months in Newgate jail, and yet still continued his campaign against Wallace upon his release, sending letters to him and to publications to which he contributed, calling him a thief and a swindler. Finally, after 15 years of harassment, Hampden was sent to jail for a year, though the legal expenses left Wallace essentially broke. In his autobiography, Wallace reflected on the stupidity of the wager. "It was all brought upon me by my own ignorance and my own fault. Ignorance of the fact that paradoxers can never be convinced, and my fault in wishing to get money from any kind of wager. It constitutes, therefore, the most regrettable incident in my life." Wallace was harshly reprimanded by professional scientists for agreeing to the wager and making established facts seem like they were up for debate. Rowbotham himself disapproved of the test, feeling that Carpenter and Hampden were bound to lose, since they did not understand the equipment involved. In 1884, Rowbotham died. 2 years later, the cause of Zetetics was taken up by Lady Elizabeth Blunt, an aristocratic creationist, who reoriented Zetetic theory far more toward biblical literalism. She founded the Universal Zetetic Society in 1893 to combat what she called scientific blasphemy, and established a journal, the Earth Not a Globe Review, to counter evolution, Newtonian mechanics, and agnosticism. But she was not to have the impact of Rowbotham or his followers. Public interest in the flat Earth had waned by this point, and the Society resorted to self-publication before eventually falling into debt over a dental fraud scandal. Really. Throughout her career, Blunt found herself more the target of mild ridicule and pity than any anger, and by 1913 her society was inactive. For 40 years, concerted opposition to the shape of the Earth went into hibernation. But it was to have quite the wake-up call, a call that would resound through one of the greatest periods in the history of human exploration and cement the name Flat Earth Society into modern folklore. And we shall be hearing that call in the next episode.